The air over Vienna hung thick with smoke and ash. Spring had come to Austria, but it carried no warmth, only the acrid stench of burning documents and the distant thunder of Soviet artillery rolling across the Danube plains. In the basement of a requisitioned villa in the Dobling district, a tall man with a deep scar running from his left cheekbone to his jaw sat alone at a wooden table. Before him lay a single leather briefcase, its brass clasps worn smooth by countless hands. Inside, forged papers, Swiss francs, and 3 different identities. The man's name was Otto Skorzeny, and within 6 months the world would call him both the most dangerous man in Europe and the most peculiar survivor of the Third Reich's collapse. But what the world didn't know, what even his closest comrades never suspected, was that the legend of Otto Skorzeny had been built on layers of deception so profound that historians would spend decades trying to separate the man from the myth, the hero from the traitor, the Nazi commando from the possible Jewish spy. To understand the enigma of Otto Skorzeny, one must first understand how the Nazi propaganda machine created heroes. Born in Vienna in 1908 to a middle-class family, Skorzeny was unremarkable in almost every way: a mediocre student, an adequate engineer, a weekend duelist who earned his signature scar in university fencing matches that meant everything to young Austrian nationalists and nothing to history. He stood 6 feet 4 inches, talked in a baritone that commanded attention, and possessed the kind of brutish handsomeness that totalitarian regimes found useful. When Germany annexed Austria in March 1938, Skorzeny joined the SS with the enthusiasm of a convert. He was 30 years old, too old for romantic idealism, young enough to crave purpose. The war gave him both. He served in the SS Das Reich division during the invasions of France, Yugoslavia, and the Soviet Union. Competent, loyal, unmemorable. By 1943, he had reached the rank of SS Hauptsturmführer, a captain, and seemed destined for the same anonymous fate as 10,000 other SS officers. Then came September 12, 1943, the day that transformed Otto Skorzeny from a faceless bureaucrat in death to a household name across 3 continents. Adolf Hitler's hand trembled as he read the intelligence report. Benito Mussolini, Il Duce, the founder of fascism, Germany's oldest ally, had been arrested by his own government and imprisoned somewhere in the Apennine Mountains. The Italian surrender was imminent. Germany's southern front was collapsing. Hitler needed a miracle. More precisely, he needed propaganda so spectacular that it could momentarily blind the Reich to the catastrophe unfolding in the East. He summoned Skorzeny to the wolf's lair. What happened next has been told and retold so many times that the story has calcified into legend. Skorzeny was given an impossible mission: find Mussolini and extract him from his mountain prison before the Allies could secure him. The location was finally identified: the Campo Imperatore Hotel, a ski resort perched at 9,000 feet atop Gran Sasso Mountain, accessible only by cable car and guarded by 200 Italian carabinieri. On the morning of September 12, 12 DFS-230 gliders descended through the clouds like predatory birds. Skorzeny's men stormed the hotel in a 15-minute operation that involved exactly 0 casualties. Mussolini, frail and confused, was bundled into a Fieseler Storch reconnaissance plane, barely capable of carrying 2 men, flown to Rome, then to Munich, then to Hitler. The newsreel showed Skorzeny standing beside the rescued dictator, his scarred face radiating Aryan confidence. The propaganda ministry exploded with joy. Here was the perfect Nazi hero, a warrior intellectual who achieved through daring what conventional forces could not. Goebbels plastered Skorzeny's face across every newspaper in occupied Europe. The most dangerous man in Europe, they called him. The knight-errant of the Third Reich. But those who looked closely at the operation might have noticed something peculiar. The Italian guards surrendered without firing a shot, not because they were cowards, but because German intelligence had already negotiated their cooperation through back channels. The gliders landed in broad daylight with suspicious precision. The entire rescue had the choreographed quality of theater designed to produce exactly the propaganda value it did. And Skorzeny himself seemed almost too perfect, too photogenic, too quotable, too eager to take credit for an operation whose actual planning had been done by Wehrmacht intelligence officer Major Otto Harold Morse. Here is where the story takes its first strange turn. After Gran Sasso, Skorzeny expected glory, promotion, the gratitude of a grateful Reich. What he received instead was suspicion. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, summoned him to a private meeting in Berlin. The conversation was never recorded, but those who saw Skorzeny emerge described a man who looked as if he'd been hollowed out from within. What had he expected? Perhaps medals, champagne, the adoration that propaganda promised. What he experienced was something different. The cold scrutiny of men who understood that heroes are dangerous precisely because people believe in them. Himmler's message was simple. Skorzeny was useful, but he was also expendable. The moment his propaganda value diminished, so would his protection. From that point forward, Skorzeny began to behave in ways that confused his superiors. He cultivated relationships with Wehrmacht officers who were known to be quietly critical of Hitler. He maintained contact with Austrian monarchists who wanted nothing to do with pan-German nationalism. And most strangely, he began to build an intelligence network that operated parallel to and sometimes in competition with official SS channels. Contemporary witnesses described a man at war with himself. In public, he played the role of loyal SS officer with theatrical precision. In private, he was calculating, cautious, and strangely well-informed about topics that should have been far outside his purview. Allied intelligence operations, partisan networks in occupied territories, the names and locations of Jewish refugees being hidden by Catholic clergy. The Battle of the Bulge using German commandos dressed in U.S. uniforms. It was technically a violation of the laws of war, potentially a war crime. Yet when captured German soldiers were interrogated, they consistently reported that Skorzeny had personally briefed them on how to surrender to American forces if compromised, had provided them with intelligence on safe routes to Allied lines, and had seemed curiously unconcerned about the operation's military effectiveness. The operation's actual impact was negligible. A handful of road signs were switched, some confusion was sown, but the psychological warfare value was enormous. For weeks, American forces were paralyzed by fear of German infiltrators. Eisenhower himself was placed under heavy guard. The operation achieved maximum propaganda with minimal military effect, as if its real purpose was to create paranoia rather than tactical advantage. Then there's the curious matter of Operation Greif's failure. Historical analysis suggests that Allied intelligence had advance warning of the operation. Not through signals, intercept, or aerial reconnaissance, but through human intelligence. Someone with intimate knowledge of SS Commando operations had provided detailed information to Allied networks. The source was never identified. In the final months of the war, as the Reich collapsed, Skorzeny's behavior became even more erratic. He evacuated to the Austrian Alps, supposedly to organize a last-ditch resistance, the mythical Alpine redoubt that Allied intelligence feared. But when American forces arrived, they found no resistance. What they found instead was Otto Skorzeny waiting for them with impeccable calm, ready to surrender, with documents meticulously organized and a list of SS officers he was prepared to testify against. At the Nuremberg trials, Skorzeny presented a paradox. He was charged with violating the laws of war for the false flag operations during the Battle of the Bulge, yet his defense was so sophisticated, his conduct so cooperative, that he became something rare in the annals of Nazi war crimes trials, a defendant who charmed his captors. British Commando officer Wing Commander Yo Thomas, known as the White Rabbit, a legendary SOE agent, testified in Skorzeny's defense, arguing that Allied forces had conducted similar operations and that prosecuting Skorzeny would criminalize standard special operations practice. It was an extraordinary moment, a British war hero defending an SS officer. The tribunal acquitted Skorzeny in September 1947. But here's what makes this truly strange. While Skorzeny was in custody, Allied intelligence officers conducted extensive debriefings. The transcripts, partially declassified decades later, reveal a man who seemed to know everything about SS operations, Nazi intelligence networks, and, most puzzlingly, the fate of Jewish refugees who had somehow escaped detection during the war years. When asked how he knew such details, Skorzeny would smile his scarred smile and deflect with professional courtesy. One interrogator, a Jewish-American OSS officer named David Stern, wrote in his personal notes, "Subject demonstrates unusual knowledge of anti-Nazi resistance networks. When pressed, claims information came from captured partisan interrogations. Explanation plausible, but insufficient. Subject may have had dual loyalties. Recommend further investigation." After his acquittal, Otto Skorzeny did not fade into obscurity as most former SS officers did. Instead, he escaped from an internment camp in July 1948. An escape so well executed it later emerged that American intelligence may have facilitated it. He fled to Spain, where Francisco Franco's fascist government welcomed him with open arms. But instead of becoming another aging Nazi in exile, Skorzeny transformed himself into something unprecedented, an intelligence broker who worked simultaneously for the Mossad, the West German government, and various right-wing regimes across South America and the Middle East. In the 1960s, Israeli intelligence declassified partial information about an operation called Alois Brunner's Hunt. The goal: assassinate or capture key Nazi war criminals who had escaped to Arab countries and were helping anti-Israeli regimes. The operation required someone with impeccable Nazi credentials, someone who could move freely among former SS officers, someone who could identify targets and provide intelligence. That someone was Otto Skorzeny. According to testimony from retired Mossad agents, Skorzeny had been recruited as early as 1952. The deal was simple. In exchange for protection and payment, he would provide intelligence on former SS officers and help facilitate operations against Nazi scientists working for Egypt's missile program. He would not kill his former comrades. Mossad understood that would break his code. But he would provide targeting information, safe houses, and operational support. The evidence is fragmentary, but compelling. In 1962, Heinz Krug, a German scientist working on Egypt's missile program, disappeared from Munich. Skorzeny had met with him 3 days earlier. In 1965, a letter bomb killed several German scientists in Cairo. The bombs had been mailed from addresses that Skorzeny had access to. When Wolfgang Lotz, a Mossad spy operating in Egypt, was arrested in 1965, Skorzeny provided the intelligence that eventually led to his release through a prisoner exchange. Throughout all these years, Skorzeny carried the same leather briefcase, the one from that Vienna basement in April 1945. Those who knew him remarked on it constantly. The briefcase was scuffed, outdated, conspicuous in its plainness. Inside, he kept papers, contacts, photographs. But more than that, he kept identities. The briefcase became his symbol, not a weapon or a uniform, but a container for secrets. In the mythology of post-war intelligence, the briefcase represented something essential about the Cold War era. Everyone had multiple allegiances. Everyone was both hunter and hunted. Everyone carried secrets that could destroy them or save them depending on who held the key. Former colleagues described opening that briefcase as an almost religious experience. Inside were layers upon layers of documentation, Nazi memorabilia that would appeal to neo-fascist groups, intelligence reports that interested Western agencies, contact information for Jewish refugee organizations, It was as if Skorzeny had prepared for every possible future, every potential identity. And perhaps that was the truth of Otto Skorzeny. He wasn't a hero or a traitor, a Nazi or a Jewish spy. He was a man who understood that survival in the 20th century required the ability to be all things to all people, to carry every identity simultaneously, and reveal only what was necessary for the moment. In 2016, a German researcher named Gerhard Paul published findings from genealogical research into Skorzeny's family history. The results were explosive. Skorzeny's maternal great-grandmother was a Jewish woman from Prague who had converted to Catholicism in the 1850s. According to Nazi racial laws, this made Skorzeny Mischlinge, a person of mixed Jewish ancestry. The implications are staggering. If Skorzeny knew about his ancestry, and evidence suggests he discovered it sometime in the mid-1930s, then his entire career in the SS was an exercise in existential camouflage. Every mission, every operation, every moment of loyalty to the Reich was performed by a man who knew that the ideology he served would have condemned him. This would explain the strange duality of his behavior, the public zealotry and private doubt, the heroic missions and the inexplicable connections to Jewish rescue networks, the post-war work for Mossad that seemed like betrayal, but might have been the only genuine loyalty he ever expressed. Former Mossad agent, Rafi Eaton, who worked with Skorzeny in the 1960s, said in a 1997 interview, "Otto never talked about his reasons, but I always felt he was paying a debt. Not to us, to something inside himself. He couldn't undo the past, but he could make the future slightly less terrible. That's all any of us can do."
The most dramatic evidence of Skorzeny's double life emerged during Operation Condor, the Mossad campaign to stop German scientists from building missiles for Egypt's President Nasser. In 1962, dozens of former Nazi engineers were working in Egypt, developing weapons explicitly intended to destroy Israel. The international community turned a blind eye. West Germany, desperate to maintain relations with the Arab world, did nothing. Otto Skorzeny was living in Madrid, running a successful engineering firm and serving as an informal advisor to various right-wing movements. To the outside world, he was exactly what he appeared to be, an unrepentant former SS officer living comfortably in Franco's Spain. But behind the scenes, Skorzeny was providing Mossad with detailed information about the German scientists, their routines, their families, their vulnerabilities. When Mossad decided to escalate from surveillance to direct action, it was Skorzeny who provided the targeting packages. In September 1962, 5 letter bombs arrived at addresses connected to German scientists in Egypt. 2 exploded, killing an Egyptian physicist and injuring several others. The operation was crude by Mossad standards, meant to terrorize rather than assassinate, but it worked. Within months, most of the German scientists had returned to Europe. What makes Skorzeny's role particularly remarkable is that he simultaneously maintained his credibility among former Nazis. He attended neo-fascist conferences, gave interviews about the glory days of the Reich, and served as a father figure to young right-wing extremists across Europe. He was, in intelligence terminology, a perfect double agent, trusted by both sides, betraying neither completely, serving his own mysterious agenda. In Madrid, Skorzeny lived openly, almost ostentatiously. He purchased a large house in the suburbs, married a Spanish woman, and operated an engineering consultancy that did legitimate business across Europe and South America. He gave interviews to journalists, posed for photographs, and made no attempt to hide his past. Yet his circle of associates was bizarre in its diversity. He maintained friendships with former SS officers who were wanted war criminals. He advised the West German intelligence service on Soviet operations. He met regularly with representatives from the Simon Wiesenthal Center. He provided security consultations to right-wing dictatorships in Argentina and Chile. And he continued his work with Mossad. How did he maintain such contradictory relationships? By being useful to everyone and loyal to no one. He told each group exactly what they wanted to hear, provided exactly enough information to maintain credibility, and never revealed the full scope of his activities. In a 1973 interview with French journalist Philippe Aziz, Skorzeny said something revealing. "People always want to know which side I was really on. They don't understand that sides are propaganda. I was on the side of survival, first my own, then as many others as I could manage." By the 1970s, Otto Skorzeny had become an anachronism, a living relic from a war that had become history. The young people who came to his house seeking wisdom about the Reich found instead a tired old man with a scarred face who told contradictory stories and seemed more interested in drinking wine than refighting old battles. His health declined. Cancer, the great equalizer, began its work, and as death approached, Skorzeny did something unexpected. He began to talk. Not confessions exactly, but hints, suggestions, fragments of a truth too complicated for propaganda. To a visiting Israeli journalist in 1974, he said, "The war made monsters of all of us, but some monsters tried to do less harm than others. I was never a good man, but I tried, in my limited way, to be less terrible than I might have been."
To a German historian in 1975, "They called me the most dangerous man in Europe. They didn't understand that the truly dangerous men were the ones who believed their own propaganda. I never believed. That was my advantage and my curse." Otto Skorzeny died on July 5, 1975 in Madrid. He was 67 years old. His funeral was attended by an impossible cross-section of 20th century history. Former SS officers in dark suits, Spanish fascists, West German intelligence agents, and, according to unconfirmed reports, at least 3 individuals with connections to Israeli intelligence. The leather briefcase was never found. Some believe it was destroyed according to Skorzeny's instructions. Others think it was seized by one of the intelligence services that had employed him. A few romantic historians imagine it sitting in an archive somewhere, waiting for the right moment to reveal its secrets. But perhaps the briefcase itself doesn't matter. What matters is what it represented. The idea that identity in the modern world is layered, provisional, and ultimately unknowable. Otto Skorzeny was a Nazi commando and a possible Jewish spy, a war criminal and an intelligence asset, a propagandist and a pragmatist. He was all of these things simultaneously and none of them completely. The question of whether he was a hero or a traitor misses the point. Heroes and traitors are concepts from an age of clear moral certainties, an age that died somewhere between the Vienna basement in 1945 and the Madrid funeral in 1975. What Skorzeny represents is something more modern and more terrifying. The man who survives history by refusing to be defined by it, who carries multiple identities because no single identity is sufficient, who betrays everything except the fundamental imperative to endure. In the end, the shocking truth about Otto Skorzeny isn't that he was a hero or a spy. It's that he was both and neither. A man who understood that in the wreckage of the 20th century, survival required the ability to be whatever the moment demanded. He carried his secrets in a leather briefcase and took most of them to his grave, leaving behind only questions and the uncomfortable realization that the line between hero and traitor is often drawn by whoever writes the history. The briefcase is gone, the man is gone. But the question remains. In a world where ideology kills millions and survival requires betraying everything you claim to believe, what does loyalty even mean? Otto Skorzeny never answered that question. He simply lived it, day by day, identity by identity, until the contradictions finally consumed him. And perhaps that is the most honest legacy any of us can leave. If this story revealed the hidden complexity behind one of history's most controversial figures, there are dozens more untold stories from the Second World War waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe to explore the forgotten missions, the secret operations, and the moral paradoxes that textbooks erase. The truth is never as simple as we're taught, and sometimes the most important stories are the ones that challenge everything we thought we knew. What other myths from the war deserve this scrutiny? Tell us in the comments, and join us as we continue to excavate history's most complicated truths.